Right. Okay. Well, I think we'll make a start then in that case, having overcome my initial issues with this system. Let me introduce myself. I'm Phil Cohen. I'm the research director of Livingmaps, and I've been responsible for putting together this program that we're running over the next few months under the general title "Frontlines Backyards." The basic idea of the program is that there are these various front lines: the health crisis, the environmental crisis, the coming global economic crisis, and there's a lot of people being locked down in various backyards, but also some very interesting initiatives emerging from lockdown and from these backyards. And what we're going to try and do in this series of events is to explore, particularly in terms of the kind of counter mapping initiatives that are developing in these new backyards, and how they are addressing issues on various front lines. So I'm delighted this evening to be able to welcome Mary Shy and sorry about her name, Erin McElroy from the San Francisco Anti-Eviction Mapping Campaign. I actually was in San Francisco about 2 years ago now, and I'd never been there before, and I'd sort of read stuff about it, including by somebody like Chris Carlson and so on. So I knew a little bit of background, but when I actually got there, I must say I was completely shocked by just walking down some of these streets and seeing these kind of camp cities, these kind of houseless people. Were living in tents, and there weren't just three or four of them. There were dozens and sometimes hundreds of people. So in this richest city practically in the world, or certainly in the United States, you had this enormous issue of evictions and people being basically being made houseless. And I did actually meet somebody from the campaign, and I was going to interview her for Livingmaps Review, which I'm an editor of. Unfortunately, we did it outside. It was a very hot day, so we went outside, and it was also very windy, as I suppose it does get in San Francisco. And it was so windy, and I mean, it just didn't. I mean, it was a very interesting interview, but unfortunately, it didn't record well enough for us to actually transcribe it and use it in the journal. So I'm delighted that we've got this second go at it in a way, and particularly in relation to this wonderful atlas that people who've been involved in this campaign over quite a number of years have put together, Counterpoints. And it's in the process of being published and produced. I've been privileged to see sort of an advanced, not an actual hard copy, but a PDF of it, and it really is a most extraordinary work, actually. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Mary and Erin talk about their campaign, about the atlas, and they're going to be showing us, giving us a preview of it, really. And then we've got a number of discussants, some members of the Living Map Network, some other people who have been housing activists, housing sort of scholar activists in the field of housing and homelessness, who'll be carrying forward the discussion and looking at some of the issues that arise from the atlas. So the initial presentation will last about 45 minutes. Then we'll have so the discussants will probably, there's 5 of them, each have 5 minutes, so that's 25 minutes worth. So there'll then be about half an hour at the end for people to come in with their questions. In the meantime, if people, of course, people are muted at the moment, but if a question occurs to you as you're watching the presentation, please do type it into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and monitor that. And if you don't necessarily want to actually speak, I can perhaps raise some of those questions for you. But we hope as many as possible will actually take part in the discussion in the latter part of the session. Okay, I think that's enough for the housekeeping. So let me then hand over I think, Mary, you're going first. Is that right?
I think Erin's starting us
Oh,
off.
Erin, sorry, Erin's starting first. So let me introduce Erin McElroy. She's a co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. Uh, and she's been there really from the beginning, and been a leading light in not only in the campaigning work but also in developing this atlas. She's also a researcher. She's based at the New York's University, um, and uh, she's also an editor of the Radical Housing Journal. But this evening, she's going to be talking us mainly about the anti-eviction campaign and the atlas. So, Erin, over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having us here today, and we're thrilled to be able to share more about the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project with you, and more about the Counterpoints Atlas. Um, and just so I can do this now before it gets glitchy, I'm gonna just switch over so I can share my screen. 1 second. Yeah. So yeah. So Mary and I are I'm going to begin this presentation by sharing more about the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and who we are and what we do more holistically. And then I'm going to hand it over to Mary, who's going to introduce more about our Atlas project, and then I will join again towards the end. So maybe, I don't know, we can introduce Mary after I go through the first part of the presentation, if that sounds good. With you, Mary. So yeah, my name is Erin. I'm a postdoc at NYU, but first and foremost a co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a data visualization and digital cartography and also multimedia collective that began in San Francisco in 2013. Today, I'm just gonna, well, let's get this here. Today we have chapters in New York City and Los Angeles too, but we're gonna be really focusing on the San Francisco Bay Area work throughout the presentation today. Just so you can see what we're gonna be doing is introducing the mapping project. I'm doing that. Then Mary is gonna talk about the Counterpoints Atlas, the origins and the backstory. And then we're gonna go through 2 of the chapters in more detail, one that Mary is an editor of, one that I'm an editor of, and that is gonna be our presentation. So really, I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about the context in which the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project emerged, which is a context, similar to what Phil was just talking about. But in short, the San Francisco Bay Area has been ravaged by gentrification in different waves over time. Arguably, we can look back to the first moment of settler colonialism to think through the kind of first and original displacements and racial dispossessive acts in the region. But we as a project began in 2013 during this moment that a lot of people refer to as the tech boom 2.0, or the second dot-com boom, but essentially a moment in which big tech companies, but also smaller startups, Airbnb, Uber, Twitter, they all moved to San Francisco, but also new private luxury transportation systems known as Google buses or Facebook buses or Apple buses started transporting tech workers to and from Silicon Valley, from cities like San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley. So what we were seeing was that a lot of people were moving to the Bay Area to work in tech, and income levels were growing, we're dividing more and more between the rich and the poor, and real estate speculators realized that they could capitalize upon that, similarly to how they capitalized upon the dot-com boom era of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And after that, we saw the foreclosure crisis, which devastated housing globally. In the Bay Area, cities like Oakland, but also other suburban regions outside of the big city centers were devastated by the foreclosure crisis. And we as a project really emerged in the aftermaths of both that. and the first dot-com boom, and then in the middle of what we're calling the second dot-com boom. But what we began to see was that in cities like San Francisco, real estate speculators started rebranding certain neighborhood spaces. You can see here on the left this quadrilateral that a real estate speculator rebranded as the Quad. This used to be, well, this is the Mission and part of the Castro. The Mission being a historically Latinx working class neighborhood. But this real estate speculator decided that she wanted to rebrand it the Quad and market it as a place for people in the tech industry to live and work. And what we began to see was that evictions and rental prices began to accumulate. So, right now, well, not now because of COVID maybe, but and we're actually seeing rents drop in San Francisco right now due to COVID. But around 2013, 2014, rents were skyrocketing, and people were on average paying between $3,000 and $4,000 a month for apartment buildings, which is a lot of money. Meanwhile, in Oakland, as you can see here on the right, parts of Oakland, like West Oakland, which are historically Black working class neighborhoods, began to get rebranded as the new frontier or new edge of Silicon Valley. So we emerged wanting to use technology to fight back and to basically embolden housing organizing and fight for the right to remain housed in these growing contexts of tech-driven inequality and dispossession. So this is the very first map that we made, we being at the time just a few housing organizers that sat down at the table in the San Francisco Tenants Union, which has housed us since we began as an organization in the Mission District, with this idea that we just wanted to create a map to show where evictions were happening. It was a pretty simple idea, and we thought we were just going to make one map and then be done as a project. We didn't imagine we would grow as much as we have. But we really wanted to make this map knowing that one of the big problems with the eviction crisis was that we didn't know who the evictors were. And without knowing who the evictors were, who the landlords and speculators were, it was hard to organize campaigns to fight back. And part of the reason why we didn't know who they were was because particularly after 2008, we saw these huge shifts of ownership structure across the US in which larger investment companies began using these smaller shell companies to purchase property. And so what you might have is a large investment company, for instance, in San Francisco, called Urban Green Investments, use a number of smaller shell companies, which might have names like 55 Dolores Street LLC or 49 Guerrero Street LLC. These investment companies will use these smaller LLCs, limited liability company, shell companies, to purchase property, and then they might they would often evict tenants through these LLCs. So a lot of tenants around 2013-14 were getting eviction notices from these shell companies who had just bought their buildings, and tenants didn't know who their actual landlords were. And so at the time, I was part of a housing action group called Eviction Free San Francisco, and different tenants would come into our meetings and say, hey, I'm being evicted by 55 Dolores Street LLC, and I want to fight back, but I don't know who to even fight against. And so really the idea that animated our project initially was to map where evictions were taking place and also the ownership networks behind them, which turned out to be a lot harder to do than we thought. We made this map showing one type of eviction, and online you can access it and hover over these different eviction sites and see who the evictor is. We were able to figure this out through kind of analog research, combining eviction data. Some eviction data we were able to get from the San Francisco Rent Board with Secretary of State corporate entity data. But this took us a very long time, and I'll kind of get into how we've continued to grow since then to better automate this process. We also created stencils and started handing them out in different tenant meetings so that people could mark outside of their buildings where evictions had taken place. Since, again, the real estate industry really wanted this process to be an invisible process. We wanted to visibilize it and also make it less desirable for people to move into buildings after folks have been evicted from them. I'm fast forwarding, but this is a project that we're currently working on called Evictor Book, which basically automates that process I mentioned earlier. So with it, you can type in an address or an LLC or investment company and figure out all the buildings that that landlord owns and where they've evicted. And so with this tool, we've developed software that brings together eviction data, parcel ownership data, and corporate entity data. Again, with the idea of emboldening on the ground housing organizing and multi-building campaigning, because so many tenants are getting evicted by different shell companies connected to singular corporate entities. We've learned through experience that having multi-building campaigns is a lot more effective in fighting a particular evictor than just fighting evictors singularly. So that's really one of the main, I guess, technological projects that we as the Mapping Project have been engaged in since the beginning, that we're kind of always iterating upon and trying to get better at. About a year after we began the project, and I'm jumping back in time to 2014, we realized that we had begun to make these maps with this idea of emboldening organizing, but that the maps themselves were often reducing really complex, nuanced experiences into simple dots on a map. And so we decided we wanted to launch what we call the Narratives of Displacement and Resistance Oral History Project, which is a narrative-based multimedia project at this point that involves recording oral histories, but also producing video work, also making murals and zines, as you can see here.
Amazing.
That really collectively tell a story of displacement through very different perspectives that hold the analytics of tenants themselves who are facing eviction, but also stories of tenants that have fought back. And this mural you can see here is a mural we created in Clarion Alley, which is a pretty famous alley in San Francisco filled with very political murals. And we were able to paint portraits of a handful of the tenants whose stories we recorded in our oral history map and have a call the wall function. So passersby can call a phone number and hear snippets of individual stories. And when we completed the mural, we held a dedication ceremony with different tenants who we painted the portraits of. And at that time, many of those tenants were still in their homes because they had successfully fought back against their evictions. And so we really wanted to capture in this mural snippets of their stories that told how they were resisting, how they were engaging in direct action in order to stay housed, with the idea that this could be a tool and inspire other tenants to also fight back. We also included the portrait you can see here on the left of a man named Alex Nieto, who was murdered by the San Francisco police in 2014. And these are Alex's parents here who painted his portrait and who narrate his story. And we wanted to include that because Alex was killed after newcomers to San Francisco racially profiled him and called the police on him, who then, four police officers from the Mission Police Station, which is incidentally right next to this mural, murdered him on the spot. And so we wanted to paint this mural to really call attention to the lethal effects of gentrification and to kind of show the complicity that a lot of gentrifiers have in emboldening the police to enact racial violence. But at any rate, we also began about a year into our existence working with different clinics in San Francisco and then soon throughout the region to produce reports. And this was in part because we had already been analyzing data we were getting from the San Francisco Rent Board in order to figure out where evictions were happening. But none of that data really told us anything about who was being evicted. And so we began working with clinics who offered counseling, legal guidance, or just legal counseling to tenants who were being evicted or being harassed by their landlords. And a lot of these clinics would and still do collect more demographic information about who is being evicted. And so we worked with clinics to figure out, for instance, in this case, that in San Francisco, Black tenants are overrepresented by 300% when it comes to evictions, which is huge. Latinx tenants are also hugely overrepresented. We were also able to figure out, begin to figure out where tenants go to after they're evicted. And this map on the right shows an interactive project we made visualizing out-migration from San Francisco through eviction. Yeah, so then we, right around the time that Mary joined the project, and she'll speak more to this, we began doing a lot more work in Alameda County, which is the county across the bay from San Francisco, where Oakland is based, as well as other cities like Fremont and the city of Alameda. And we had, from the beginning, we had wanted to map gentrification and eviction in the East Bay in Alameda County, but we had a much more difficult time obtaining eviction data. And so we launched a very intentional project with many community partners in 2016 in order to begin to map gentrification and displacement. And part of that involved producing video pieces, as you can see here on the right. This video you see on the bottom is actually the release event we held when we released a large interactive report that we created with our community partners, which also included, on the left, you can see our first ever community power map, where we intentionally decided, in addition to just mapping displacement and these really kind of horrific experiences, we wanted to intentionally map sites of power and community assets to help us all collectively remember and think through what we're fighting for and what still remains and what we want to preserve. And I'm showing this too because the name of this first report that we made was actually called Counterpoints, but that was before we ever envisioned that we were going to be making a book. So in a sense, our first report in Alameda County that contained all of these stories and this community power map is, in some ways, you can see, like the predecessor for the Atlas Project, one of many predecessors, I suppose. And yeah, so more recently we released a video. It's a 30-minute film that you can find on our website called Tenants Rise Up, which also kind of builds upon some of this earlier narrative work we began doing in Alameda County. And this film project ties together 3 different regional stories, one in San Jose, one in Santa Rosa, and one in Oakland. And it's really an homage, or like a love letter to tenant organizing. And we just released that about a month ago. All of it was filmed pre-COVID, but we held a launch party in which we kind of looked at connections between the organizing that was happening pre-COVID and the organizing that's happening today. As you know, a third to a half of tenants can't pay rent and are organizing rent strikes and are pushing for eviction moratorium extensions. But we really wanted to think about how all of the organizing that's happening builds upon a much longer history of tenant organizing. But this film project really, pays homage to. And then I think this is the last thing one of the last things before I hand it over to Mary. We published a zine last year that we'd been working on for a few years, but it's sort of a joke that it's a zine because it's I'm forgetting, is it 150 pages? It's something like this. It might as well be a book, but it's called Black Exodus. And it's the story of Black gentrification and Black experiences of gentrification, rather, in San Francisco, with themes that focus on health, on education, and on public housing. And this zine was a collaborative effort with numerous Black-led arts collectives and activist collectives in San Francisco. And part of what the scene wanted to do, and does very well, is kind of look at a longer history of displacement and Black experiences of displacement in San Francisco that really predate this tech moment that we had really centered when we began mapping evictions in San Francisco, because urban renewal and redevelopment really decimated neighborhoods like the Fillmore and Western Addition, which had been these sort of meccas of Black culture, and then redevelopment and urban renewal really it led to tens of thousands of people being displaced in the 60s and 70s and so forth. And so we really wanted to kind of trouble our own kind of way of centering the present and to think more historically. And a lot of that you can see in the Atlas, and Mary will get to that too, but that was one of our many incentives in then wanting to produce an atlas. We wanted to think more historically and not overly center over the present in order to think how the past still impacts the present. Yeah, and then I'm not going to get into this too much, but in 2017 we launched new chapters of the mapping project, one in New York and one in Los Angeles. Today we have, I don't know exactly, but I would say probably 15 to 20 people in each chapter, all of whom are volunteers working on an array of projects. It's really, the mapping project is a work of love and labor, and it's been really amazing to see these new chapters grow and to have folks in all the chapters now working together on projects such as this, which is our first global map, which we made in response to COVID to visualize eviction moratoriums and rent strikes globally. And so we've got other endeavors like this in the works, but I'm just showing this to kind of point to our own kind of ongoing expansion and collaborative efforts across our different chapters and with new community partners globally. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary, who's going to talk more about the Atlas specifically. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. Really amazing. It's amazing work you guys are doing. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. But let me then just introduce Mary, who is also one of the, been one of the leading forces in this amazing series of projects. I think, is a Bay Area resident, and Bay Area is a kind of rather special kind of notion of, of a place to live, I guess. And Mary's been very active in work, not only around housing, I think, in the Bay Area. And I think you're going to give us a bit of the kind of wider context of the project, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
So let me hand over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Phil, for that introduction. And thanks, Erin, for introducing the project. Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Mary Shai. I've been working with the mapping project since 2015, as Erin's mentioned, originally mostly on the Alameda project. And now Erin and I are co-project wranglers for the Atlas as a whole, but we can't take credit because this really is the labor of love of dozens of individuals. And I'm also a PhD candidate at Berkeley currently. So I'm going to give a little bit of a backstory of the backstory and kind of the logic behind how we organize counterpoints, and then dive a little bit deeper into. We're going to dive a little deeper into two chapters, so to give you guys kind of a taste of what's in the Atlas. I'll be talking about Chapter 6, Migrations, Relocations, and Erin will be talking about Chapter 7, Speculation, Speculative Futures. Next slide, please. So in terms of Atlas origins, as Erin already mentioned, the idea of the Atlas really started to coalesce and emerge in late 2016, early 2017, as the mapping project was kind of wrapping up some of its first forays of work outside of San Francisco proper. So throughout 2015, 2016, we had been working on the Alameda report, which we ended up titling Counterpoints, and then in 2016, the mapping project also started working with the Eviction Defense Collaborative. Is that correct, Erin? In San Mateo, San Mateo Legal Aid in San Mateo, and that experience had kind of taught the mapping project that. This narrative about the housing crisis in the Bay Area, which had predominantly tended to focus on what was happening in San Francisco, what was happening in Oakland, or what was happening in the South Bay and kind of those tech centers, Cupertino, Mountain View, where Silicon Valley was, really missed kind of the broader regional context of displacement in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is it's a bigger regional, it's a regional economy. It's a really diverse area. When people are displaced from one place, they're really kind of displaced into another. Their commute flows, inequalities, etc. There is a big diversity of the problem in the Bay Area, nuances to the problem in the Bay Area that we hadn't really been addressing before. So we were really kind of starting to see the regional scope of displacement in the Bay Area. At the same time, we were also starting to get turned on to kind of the broader historical and structural forces that were structuring Bay Area displacement, everything from like settler colonialism to race and class, things like that. And we were also kind of thinking that it would be really amazing to do some work that could have a offline presence, because work like the Oakland Community Power Map that we had done at the Beniono Gallery in Oakland and the Clarion Mural Alley and the zine had shown us that, and the stencils really at the beginning of the project had shown us that like different types of solidarities can be made when you're doing the work in person in a way. And we wanted to expand access to the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project's work, which until then was mostly online mapping to kind of an in-person audience. So regional, structural, historical, accessible, these were kind of some of the big ideas these were some of kind of the impulses that we were having around late 2016, early 2017. And the way that we kind of thought, okay, how can we bring all these things together? We were thinking a print atlas could really be the right way to do that. When we coalesced on the idea of a print atlas, we also started thinking like, okay, so then we want to create an atlas that's not just of the mapping project's work. We don't want it to just be, things that we've done in print form. We wanted to create an atlas with the Bay Area as a whole, a co-created atlas as much as possible that could reflect as many different voices in the Bay Area as possible. We wanted to create a platform for our community partners who are doing so much amazing work. We wanted to create a platform for like other academics or policy workers or organizers or artists who were also doing amazing work but maybe didn't have a platform for some of their most critical perspectives. We wanted to create that as well. So we were thinking co-created, structural, historical, regional, accessible atlas, right? So that was kind of like the impulses behind the original atlas. Next slide, please. To kind of to try to create a co-created atlas, instead of, like I said, just pulling from existing mapping project work, we did an open call for ideas that we circulated in early 2018 with local housing activists, organizers, long-term community members, academics, etc. And at this point, we were thinking, we asked for submissions of whatever people wanted, right? Like poetry, illustrations, other mapping ideas, etc. The only thing we were thinking was we wanted to be able to organize the atlas thematically around a few themes that had been emerging, which would ultimately become the different chapters of the atlas. We received over 20 submissions through this open call for submissions and accepted 17. And then at the same time, organized around these themes that we were thinking for the atlas, we reached out to a lot of community partners and commissioned like dozens more different contributions. Next slide, please. At the same time, we started kind of mining the existing work that the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project had done and considering how different pieces of what we had done in terms of online maps could be transformed into print maps. So in addition to kind of the challenges of working with dozens of community partners, external community partners, another one of the challenges of creating the atlas was translating online interactive maps into print maps. So here I kind of like give a small example of the police killings in San Francisco map, which began its life as an online interactive map, which on the left, you can imagine like as your cursor moves around the screen, you can get a little bit more information about each dot. It's color coded and there are kind of like toggable layers that exist on the online map that don't exist in the print map. And then the print map, when we were translating all of these online maps into print maps, we had to make a lot of decisions about exactly which stories we were going to tell, how we were going to represent this rich data, and then in particular, when we were trying to take a more regional look, which parts of the Bay Area to focus on. So that was one of the challenges that we had with creating the print atlas. Next slide, please. The atlas that emerged from this kind of co-created collaborative process, we organized around 7 thematic chapters. So the 7 thematic chapters are evictions and root shock, indigenous geographies of resistance, health and environmental racism, gentrification and state violence, infrastructure, transportation and economy, migrations, relocations, speculation and speculative futures. And the way that we organized, and each chapter is headed by a team of like 1 to 4 Anti-Eviction Mapping Project based chapter editors who did the work of really kind of pulling together work from within the project and external contributors and trying to create a series of cohesive snapshots organized around each theme. Each chapter, we were also really intentional about including bits of oral histories from the Narratives of Displacement and Resistance project, as well as examples, not just of displacement, but of resistance, and trying to create an atlas that could create space, not just to inform, but also inspire, and also include policy analyses in each chapter that would kind of combat the individualizing tendency of this type of analysis, and trying to remind people like these are structural issues, these are issues that can be organized around, these are issues that can be explained, these are not anonymous market forces that are creating displacement. The final atlas has over 225 illustrations, photographs, data visualizations, images, and over 120,000 words of oral histories, essays, analyses, etc. Next slide, please. So in terms of chapter, kind of highlighting a few chapters, we wanted to tell you guys a little bit more about chapter 6, migrations, relocations, and chapter 7, speculation and speculative futures. In terms of chapter 6, we thought that chapter 6 could really illustrate why. Chapter 6 was really kind of the expression of our intention to really create a regional atlas. We wanted to create an atlas that captured the diversity of the Bay Area. We wanted to create an atlas where everyone could see themselves at least slightly represented in. Chapter 6 also really kind of illustrates the challenges of trying to describe a really regional process in a print atlas. So what we ultimately did, so chapter 6 ultimately combines analyses at really multiple scales. Next slide, please. So chapter 6 includes really kind of like region-wide demographic analyses of, for example, like population change and uneven suburbanization in the Bay Area, how to visualize that kind of thing. Next slide, please. And also like, you know, really using large-scale demographic data to, for example, like highlight the diversity, the ethnic diversity of the Bay Area, and really highlight, kind of visualize the Bay Area as an immigrant community, as an immigrant space, which is not necessarily something that a lot of existing narratives do. Next slide, please. But it also tries to kind of get at the Bay Area at a more meso level. So for example, chapter 6 also has this really great timeline of exclusionary policies against ethno-racial minorities, but in particular particularly Black exclusion in the city of Alameda. So this is really kind of looking at that historical longue durée, the structural effects of this of how flows work in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. But chapter 6 also hones in and tries to analyze like really specific moments as well, and tries to kind of capture the texture of displacement as an individual experience. So in terms of like really honing in, we also have a really great contribution, which is an archaeology of an evicted homeless or houseless community in the city of Albany. So also some really micro analyses. Next slide, please. Throughout the chapters, migrations, relocations, we were trying to think of displacement and flows of people as a process, as a relational process. So there are, so that's a theme that kind of suffuses the chapter throughout, including, for example, in this map, which kind of counterposes the places that send new residents to the Bay Area and the places where evicted residents from San Francisco end up. And you kind of see this really striking difference of knowledge economies sending places to the Bay Area and evicted residents from San Francisco being forced into what like urbanists would call maybe like second tier cities in the United States. And this is original data collected through with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and the Eviction Defense Collaborative. Next slide, please. And again, always keeping that kind of structural focus. So also considering the broader history of immigration policy and kind of broader, you could say like political economic shifts in like capitalism in this time period and tech, and putting that in broader context. Next slide. And this chapter, which really we've given you like a small preview of what's in the chapter and kind of the diversity of what happens in this atlas. In this chapter, we also wanted to end with highlighting resistance. And in particular, the essays that end this chapter highlight how cultural diversity and immigrant communities and faith-based communities, they were really the bedrock of some of the organizing we saw outside of San Francisco, Oakland. And we wanted to highlight those as like sources of those community sources of strength and place-based power as a way to resist displacement in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it back over to Erin to discuss chapter 7.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I'm going to just talk a little bit about chapter 7, which is the last chapter. So you're really getting a preview of the last 2 chapters of the book. So you'll have to buy it to learn more about the other chapters. But this chapter is a chapter I co-edited with my colleague, Minasa Maharawal. And initially we were thinking it would be just, a chapter where we would examine the financialization of housing and kind of how real estate speculation works throughout the Bay Area. But the more we thought about it, the more we really wanted to, given that it's the last chapter, make sure it was also a place where we thought about speculative futures and future making and what it means to create housing futures antithetical to those of housing financialization and racial capitalism. So I'm going to just show you a few of the maps and content pieces that we have in this chapter by way of concluding our presentation. So let's see. So yeah, in this chapter we have, like I said, we wanted to better just kind of break down how speculation works. So processes that I mentioned earlier in which investment companies use these shell companies to purchase property and evict tenants, processes like that are very opaque. And while we talk about evictions and map evictions in the first chapter of the Atlas, we don't really in the first chapter get into the mechanics of real estate speculation and what it means to speculate upon property, buy property, flip property, and really commodify it as the real estate industry does. So we have diagrams such as that you see on the left, and illustrations such as the one on the right that really kind of get into how speculation is working and how people are fighting back and resisting. We also have 3 different illustrations, maps essentially, in this chapter that are not geospatial maps, but that really map the relationships between investment and eviction and corporate ownership. So that investment company I mentioned earlier, Urban Green Investments, this is a map we made of the investment company, looking at who the different key people are involved in it. It turns out that it's a family-owned investment company run by this man named David McCloskey, who is the CEO of Urban Green Investments in San Francisco. Turns out his father, Thomas McCloskey, is the CEO of a parent company to Urban Green Investments in Colorado called Cornerstone Holdings. And together they have created this very complex network. And so we wanted to kind of map out how Urban Green Investment buys properties, evicts tenants with it and through these shell companies, but also the different political connections. And so you can see here, like if you dive into this and kind of follow all of lines, you'll see ties to both the Republican and Democratic parties in the US, to various police departments, to conservative think tanks like the Aspen Institute, which is based in Colorado and is considered a think tank that the Republican Party uses a lot, and so forth and so on. So we have maps like this. Also, similarly, this is it's sort of it's a comical map of sorts, but Ron Conway is a venture capitalist that some people call the mayor of San Francisco. He has been behind the campaigns of numerous elected officials in San Francisco and throughout the Bay Area, but also companies like Airbnb and Google, and yeah, a lot of tech companies. He, as an angel investor, has poured capital into and been able to use that capital to influence elections and also policies. So we do work such as this map in breaking down his influence and shining light upon it. But kind of getting at what I was mentioning earlier in terms of speculative futures and the kind of crafting of the types of cities we want to live in. We also in this chapter have pieces like this, which look at different rent strikes. Well, in particular, this particular rent strike by tenants at a building called Midtown in San Francisco. They've been on rent strike and actually just successfully won their campaign about a month or two ago. But they were a community that had been dispossessed from the Fillmore during urban renewal and had been offered new housing that they were supposed to have rent protections in, and that the city then tried to take those protections away, and they fought back, and many of the residents, such as Phyllis Bowie here on the left, who's a community partner in this project, went on rent strike. And yeah, so we wanted to talk about the history of rent strikes and how rent strikes can help create the type of futures we want to live in. We also include this pledge map that you see here on the right, which is a map that we created where tenants or anybody can really look up an address, determine if there was ever an eviction there, and if so, pledge not to rent or buy from that landlord, kind of invoking the boycott history of, we realized that actually the word boycott comes from 19th century Ireland when there was a slumlord named Sir Charles Boycott, and tenants went on a rent strike and boycotted him. So we wanted to kind of think through the history of that too in this piece. We also look at land trusts as, of course, one other model of decommodifying housing and taking it off the market. And this is a successful struggle where the tenants at this building in the Mission called Pigeon Palace built a campaign to remain housed in their home when their landlord was trying to sell it, and got the community land trust involved, who purchased the building. And so now the tenants have 99-year leases. And then, lastly, we worked with elementary school youth to basically create a counter map, one that could envision the city that they wanted to live in. So this is what they created, where they were able to rename streets and landmarks and really use their imaginations to think about what a safe and loving city would look like. And this is what they came up with. And this is the very last map that we have in our atlas, because we really did want to kind of end on that note of reimagining and speculating in the anti-capitalist sense of speculation. So yeah, that's how we conclude our atlas, which, Mary, do you want to talk about purchasing it? Or
yeah, I can briefly talk about that. So this atlas, which like this giant labor of love, 7 sprawling chapters, you're supposed to be able to pick it up, open it to any page, and kind of get a taste of the Bay Area, a different slice of the Bay Area. PM Press is the publishing house that bravely took this project on. So you can pre-order the atlas from PM Press. And it's currently in like the very final stages of production. So we should be shipping it out early 2021 at the latest, really. But this is our beautiful cover, and And yeah, we're really excited to be taking this project into its next phase of its life, which is really seeing the conversations that emerge around it. Because that's, like I said, it's supposed to capture all these different kind of viewpoints into the Bay Area and the processes that are creating the Bay Area and displacement in the Bay Area. And we want to see what people do with that. And we want to see what people can do with this knowledge and with the types of solidarities it can create. So we're really excited to be here talking about this and sharing this with everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary and Erin. It's really a brilliant presentation of an amazing project, and I mean, we've all got a lot to learn from it. Certainly at Livingmaps, you know, you've been an inspiration to us. I mean, we're at a much lower level of what we're doing at the moment, but still, to see what you've been able to do is just, it's so encouraging, and it's also, your work is so imaginative, you know. So well, we thought, you know, you just said you want a kind of conversation to build around the atlas, and so we thought, well, there might be two areas that we could explore in this conversation. And I don't know, my thing is doing something odd, but I'll ignore it. So the two areas that we thought we'd explore in the discussion would be, one, to look at some of the similarities and differences in the housing crisis and the campaigns around housing justice in the US and in the UK. So that might be the focus of the first part of the conversation. And in the second part, we might then look at the connections between your initiative and other counter mapping initiatives, including some of the kind of work we're doing, and explore some of the issues around kind of radical cartography that your work so brilliantly exemplifies, really. So to kick us off, so we've got a number of discussants that we've invited to come along, and we're going to start with two people who are both scholar activists. I mean, people who are active in housing campaigns, but have also done a lot of research around the issue. And first off, I'm going to invite Paul Watt, who's Professor of Urban Studies at Birkbeck College. He's on the editorial board of City. He's researched and written widely about housing policy, urban regeneration, gentrification, and process of social displacement. And I think he's got a number of books. I edited with him about the impact of the Olympics on East London, but he has a new book out, which is called Estate Regeneration and Its Discontent. I think it's based on research that he's done over quite a number of years on that issue. So, Paul, you've got 5 minutes without hesitation, contradiction, or anything else to talk.
Okay, yeah, well, just to say, you know, thanks very much, Sharon and Mary. It's, you know, Phil shared the PDFs, and, you know, I've looked at several of the chapters, well, I've looked at all of them. And I've got to say, it's a phenomenal achievement. I just, to be frank, I just don't know how you did it. I'm just really, it really is a phenomenal achievement, the way that you've brought together a huge range of collaborators to work on the project. It's visually stunning. It's really brilliant. You know, and you know, the way that what you've done is the bringing together of the kind of like you've crossed a lot of divides. You know, there's a big debate in social science about quantitative and qualitative research. You know, you've kind of just managed to you've done it. You've basically fused those things together, and you've managed to link the stories with the data in a way which is really, really incredible. Very inspiring. The other thing that I really like about it is the way that, you know, you've talked a lot about evictions and about, you know, the health issues in relationship to displacement and evictions. But what I really liked is also the way that so, you know, that's kind of like the negative impacts on displacement of those people who are negatively affected by it. But also the way then that you've looked at the top-down issues around how does the real estate industry work, how do these speculators work, how does the real estate market work. So that, again, bringing that the top down, the bottom up is just really, really great to see. And I'm certainly going to be recommending it to my students at Birkbeck as you know, it's an exemplary piece of work. And I wish I could do half of, you know, a small fraction of what you've done. Yeah, in terms of thinking about the kind of like the comparisons between, most of my work is based around London, and thinking about parallels between London and San Francisco, about the States generally. And this, I suppose, really links up to the way that what we've got is to, I think it really comes across in the book is that the US system is incredibly different from the Northern European system. And this links very much to the role of public housing and or more broadly, social housing, which, obviously in San Francisco, I think 2/3 of the population of San Francisco are private renters, roughly. But I know that, public housing units in San Francisco, I think it peaks about 7,000 back in the 1970s, and it's kind of then it plateaued, went down to about 6,000 in 2011. So, to about 6,000. In the London context, the peak of public housing was back in the early 80s, something like 770,000 public housing units, another 100,000 social housing association units. So you're talking about 870,000 social rental units. So, well over 100 times the size of the San Francisco public sector. And even if you need to take into account the different size between San Francisco and London, you've still got a ratio of something like over 10:1, basically. So it's very, very different. And I think that obviously reflects the political economy, the long-term political economy of the UK and the US, but also not just the UK, but also Northern European capitalist societies generally. And a lot of the housing politics has been linked to issues around public housing provision or social housing provision more broadly. Whereas in the States, a lot of, because of the huge numerical dominance of the private rental market. So obviously a lot of your book is concerned with, those grassroots struggles of people, private renters, trying to resist evictions from the private rental market. So, the London if you were to do a sort of similar mapping in exercise in London, which would be great to see, obviously, but obviously you'd have much more in relationship to the role played by public housing, social housing in that context. Having said that, obviously what's happened over the last 20 years in London is the way, or 20, 30 years, is the way that what we've got is that social housing, public housing is diminishing in importance, but private rental housing now, it's something like over a quarter of households in London are now, private renters. And what's been interesting, particularly over the last, 5 years or so, is the way that private renting has become much more important in relationship to the housing politics in London. For example, we've got the London Renters Union, which has been doing great work around the kind of issues that you're talking about, defending people with evictions, etc. So, so they're kind of like very, very, very different cities in lots of ways, and the housing politics are very different in lots of ways as well. But nevertheless, because of the increasing role of private renting that we're seeing in London and right across the UK generally, the kind of issues around the politics of private renting are obviously going to become much, much more important. What else? Interesting the things about YIMBYs, and kind of like that's kind of like now, it's kind of like a feature of the London model. But I thought that issue around, kind of like, well, the way that YIMBYs basically saying, any housing is better than no housing. And that's a kind of very powerful narrative that has been framing the official discourse around the London housing crisis is, look, we've got to build some more houses because the population's going up. That's the argument. And the response to that is, and Glenn will, I'm sure, talk about this as well, the key thing in London is very much what is the housing tenure? What is the housing tenure of the properties that are going up? Who can actually afford, these new developments? I live in Islington. The skyline near where I live is actually chock-a-block with all kinds of cranes around building these new luxury apartments. As everybody in London knows, the problem is that none of those apartments are affordable to local people. So again, it's this sort of, it's countering that kind of like very powerful narrative that, that any housing is better than no housing. And I think, certainly I would argue that that's really not the point. The fundamental point is what kind of housing and who is getting that housing in this city. And as I said, a lot of the issues there in relationship to the supply of social housing or public housing, basically. So, but anyway, I've got to say, I think my 5 minutes are well up. So, but I've just got to say, it's a really fantastic achievement, and really, I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to definitely recommend it to my students, and I'll recommend it to it's housing activists as well. I think it's a really tremendous piece of work. So and, yeah, thanks very much for inviting me, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Paul, very much. Thank you. Right now, Glyn Robbins. I know you were having some problems with your internet. Are you still with us?
I think so, Phil. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay, let me just briefly introduce you. So we've invited Glyn because, in a way, he kind of straddles the Atlantic, but it's a bit of a tall ask, isn't it? But basically, he's done work and research around tenant housing justice campaigns in the US. I think he's been recently in reasonably recently in San Francisco, and he's generally been doing research around issues of social displacement also in the UK. So we've asked him, just to kind of comment on, his responses to the atlas and the kinds of connections that he can make to that in terms of his own work. Okay, Glyn?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Phil. Hello, everybody. Just echo what Phil and Paul have said, really, in terms of congratulating Erin and Mary and others for the work. And, it brings back memories for me, as Phil's alluded to. I was in San Francisco earlier this year, but also in 2015. And I guess to illustrate why the work is so important, it takes me back to the 9th of June, 2015. And I was just in the city for a few days because I'm a housing campaigner, as well as the other things Phil's talked about. I wanted to get involved in what was going on. And I found out that there was going to be an eviction one morning, and that there was going to be a protest, and that I needed to be there. So I turned up at 812 Guerrero Street. I got a feeling Erin might have been there. And the point was that I arrived there knowing nothing, and because of the mapping, to some extent, within a fairly short period of time, I knew quite a lot. So I knew that it was Becky who was due to be evicted that morning, along with Evan. I also knew that the home from which they were going to be evicted was owned by a Google executive. I mean, it really was a kind of eviction almost out of a movie. I'm going to say something about films in a moment. But really the point is that the mapping exercise familiarized me as an outsider with the situation very, very quickly. But also, and I think Mary referred to this, humanized the situation. This wasn't some kind of anonymous out of space process. This was about real people. And of course, the more corporate housing becomes, the more inclined we are, I guess, to think about it in those institutional terms. And to some extent, that's right, because it is about huge, swirling amounts of capital stampeding around the world. But it ultimately does come down to the Evans and to the Beckys. And so that morning, there was about 70 of us outside that house. And it was successful. The sheriff arrived. I was excited because I expected someone to arrive on a horse, but actually, no, in a car. But as soon as they saw 70 people standing there ready to resist the eviction, they turned around. Now, I know that was one of countless similar incidents, and they're not always successful. And obviously the mapping project vividly demonstrates that. But I think it is important to sort of look behind the brilliant production values and see this as a practical tool to help fight evictions. So just a couple more brief points. I did want to mention, for people who aren't familiar with San Francisco and the dynamics of what Erin and Mary have been talking about, recommend a film that came out, I think it was earlier this year, called Last Black Man in San Francisco.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I'm not sure if others have seen it, but it's a slightly offbeat film, but it does capture some of the essence of what Mary and Erin have talked about, and especially the racist dimension of that. Now, as Phil said, I was in the city in March, and I went out to a place called Hunter Bay Point, which again, I'm sure Erin and Mary know. This is a public housing development and a council estate similar to the one that I work on. But I think from a UK perspective, I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with public housing in America, but it is peripheralized, if that's a word, marginalized geographically to an extent that I don't think we're quite familiar with in this country. And so Hunter Bay Point, for example, is in San Francisco, but it took a long time to get there. And these were predominantly people who had been displaced by, as Erin was describing, other parts of the inner city where African American communities in particular had been for years. But I think finally, as Phil has invited me to do, to talk about what's going on here. We are in Britain, I'd say, on the cusp of an eviction crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen, certainly in my lifetime. The campaigns I'm involved with, we have information suggesting that there are at least 36,000 people currently in the legal pipeline heading towards an eviction notice. And I'm seeing it at work. Only today I was trying to help out an 89-year-old woman who has been threatened with eviction by her private landlord, having lived in the home in question for over 50 years. And we might have a happy ending on that one too, but I think we need to remember that for every one happy ending, there are a lot more unhappy endings. And really it's beholden on all of us to get organised and to start learning from each other. I often go to the States and come back feeling inspired, partly because of the creativity that we've heard about in this meeting so far, but also, and as Paul has mentioned, it's partly because the dynamics are different because of private renting being that much more significant in the US. But all tenants in the UK are now under threat because of COVID, because of loss of income, loss of jobs. And we really are going to need a national campaign to prevent a housing, well, we get too hyperbolic about it, but a catastrophe, really. I mean, when you think about the numbers and the fact that this isn't going away, and that's before we even think about the amount of rent arrears that are accumulating through no one's fault, essentially. And again, the US is somewhat ahead of us on this point. The demand for rent cancellation is absolutely fundamental to this discussion going forwards. But yes, at this point, I think certainly from a campaigning perspective here, I'm involved in a group called Homes for All. We've got a meeting coming up next Wednesday, actually, with Ken Loach, the film director, and he's going to be talking about his work and how it has illustrated social injustice over the years and housing in particular. And we are going to hope to use that meeting to launch or boost at least a national no evictions campaign and force our government to honour a pledge they made, which was that no one would lose their home during a pandemic. And if you want any more information about that, do get in touch. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks very much, Glyn. That was very, very helpful. Well, now, I think one of the issues that comes out so strongly in the Counterpoints Atlas is the voice of the homeless or the houseless, if you like, and then the importance of that voice is heard. The next person I've asked to be one of our discussants is a member of the Livingmaps network, and I met him when he was doing his PhD thesis, which was actually a fantastic piece of work about a project he did with the Museum of Homelessness, using sound and sound mapping as a way of exploring some of the more hidden dimensions of that experience. So I thought I'd ask Paul, are you there? I'd ask
Yep.
Paul. I'd ask Paul
Hi,
just
Phil.
maybe to just to give us some first thoughts about you've had a look at some of the work, the Counterpoints Atlas. Any kind of responses that you have?
Sure. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Erin and Mary. That was incredible. I'm sort of, as it were, looking up at you, but from a very early stage in my own sort of attempts at counter mapping, and that was so inspiring, as everyone has said. I guess the context that my work with the Museum of Homelessness came out of, and that my own their project and my research was sort of more in a kind of museum heritage space. I've been trying to cobble together some thoughts along those lines, but I'll try and keep it brief. I'd much rather hear more from you both, to be honest. But I guess one of the things that's so striking to me from that museum perspective is the way in which you manage to deal with. I mean, even in the written form, it's clearly a struggle to deal with the complexity, the kind of the density of the corporate mechanisms that you're having to navigate and try to understand. It strikes me that in the ways that the sort of narratives that people traditionally or habitually understand themselves through, the histories they locate themselves within, there's a real lack of storytelling about the place of corporations and all that, and this kind of unpacking of various kind of shell companies and the way they're all nested within one another, I found fascinating. And I think it's something, the way that probably coming from a research practice which was quite qualitative and often really leaning on, in this case, people who'd experienced homelessness, leaning on their experiences and their own narratives, they were typically completely unable to explain the systems that had led them to be where they were. I wonder how you found that through this process. It seems that there's a kind of a core of clearly of activists who are working incredibly hard to get informed about this stuff. But it strikes me that there must be an awful lot of people who you've worked with and met who perhaps didn't have the first idea of the kinds of forces that were bringing themselves to bear on their lives. Perhaps I'm wrong in that, but I'd love to hear more about how this project, in terms of what the outcomes of counter mapping are, how it worked as a form of consciousness raising, of giving people a grip on what was happening to them, even the affirmation that it was something that was happening to them, rather than the kind of the standard neoliberal narrative that it's all your fault. I'd love to hear more about that. It's certainly something that those structural causes I found really hard to get out of sort of participatory co-ethnography, that kind of work. I had a chance to look through a couple of the chapters that was really interesting, not 6 or 7, unfortunately, so I've got those to look forward to. But coming back to thinking in terms of chapter 3, where there's a discussion of Hunter's Point and the way that the community organized together to kind of try to initially clean up a power station, and then found themselves victims of gentrification, having done the hard work of tidying up an area. And I wondered how you think about the future, the sort of potentials of counter mapping, when it seems so often that anything positive leads to a kind of, to further churn, to areas becoming desirable, and success ultimately leading to defeat or to just new threats. And then the final thought I had, just to keep it super brief, was around, and again on the future, was around the kind of values that you develop or that you try to defend in terms of communities, and how you work with those politically. It strikes me in the idea of root shock that's discussed in chapter 1, and that's clearly so important in terms of the sort of just the tolls on people's health that being displaced can have. It's quite a conservative goal in many ways to resist that. It's kind of a sort of weird backwards world where maybe you're coming from the left, you have corporate bodies who are talking about moving fast and breaking things, and there's this kind of counter politics which is about, retaining and holding and nurturing, and this can seem it seems quite conservative in some senses, and I wonder how you mobilize that effectively, if at all. And it's also often exactly the kind of rhetoric that's kind of being mobilized against particularly ethnic minorities, this sort of sense of, this is our place, you should be gone. So how do you use that? I guess I'm skeptical about the kind of the language and the postures of placemaking, and I wonder how, because so often it's just a sort of early stages of commodification. So how do you use that? Those were the sort of thoughts that it raised in me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to ask any questions. I realise I've been reading notes and leaning in horrifically close to the screen and staring at you, so apologies for that. But yeah, thanks so much again. And maybe great to pick up any of those points.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I'm going to ask Erin and Mary to respond at the end of this. But now I thought to ask somebody who's also very actively involved in Livingmaps. I mean, obviously, your project has a lot of resonances with us, and particularly around this Young Citizens Atlas that we're working on. And Mike Duggan is he's editor of our journal. He's also actively involved in the group putting together the toolkit for this Young Citizens Atlas. So, Mike, are you there somewhere? I wondered if you had some comments or general kind of, sort of things that you wanted to kind of raise with Erin and Mary.
Absolutely, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so just to follow everyone else, congratulations on this really quite impressive piece of work. It's not an understatement to say that what you're doing is you're changing the way that countermapping has been done in the past, and I think you're going to provide a new audience for countermapping projects. I think the way that it's designed is accessible, and you get more than perhaps the usual countermapping kind of thing. So the individual stories that you tell and the range of perspectives that you give really brings a kind of fresh face to countermapping, which I think, there's a long history of countermapping in San Francisco, which I'm sure you're well aware of. But there is something special about this collection of maps and what they're trying to do, and I think they're maybe trying to do a bit more than the usual countermapping collectors that we've seen. I'm just going to talk briefly, then I'm going to ask you some questions. I focused on chapter 2, so I really enjoyed the introduction, then I focused on the indigenous cartographies chapter. And what I think the book does really well is it puts, and you kind of suggest this in your introduction, Mary, your prefatory note around you're starting a conversation, and one of the conversations which is key, particularly in in America, is conversations between indigenous communities as well as people being displaced from other communities. And I think what the book does is it provides a kind of nice fertile ground to begin that work. So, when we think about sort of moving forward in the States, there is a kind of a coexistence which needs to take place in these kind of activist practices. So an acknowledgement of land is one thing which the book gets really, really right, as well as acknowledging individual cultures and how they can work together. So it's not necessarily a case of the maps or the stories showing a kind of a unified front, but it's showing respect for each other's cultures and each other's land. And that aspect of land is really central to some of the maps and some of the stories which you tell. And I think when I'm from the background of cultural geography and critical cartography, and often some of the theorizing which goes on in this discipline is very abstract from the land itself. And I think you bring the land back and you make it really clear to the reader that the land is really important. And I like the way that you've used, Eve Tuck's notion that decolonization is not a metaphor; it's an actual practice of giving land back, and that really comes out in that second chapter through those stories. I thought that was brilliant. So the questions that I had were, I guess, a little bit around the process, and I was interested, Erin, in the new digital platform that you've been working on, and whether that change to a digital way of working, if that's the way to say it, has changed the mapping process itself. So does it detach you from the people and the stories that you're trying to tell, or does it kind of reshape it in a new way? The other thing was about how the participants, how the voices and the stories in the book, what do they think about the maps that you made from their stories, and what kind of feedback have you had from them? And the third question, which I always ask people that make counter maps, is how to get these maps into the hands of people that might be able to make a difference. So quite clearly in the houses of housing campaigners and activists, they make a difference. Can we get these products into the hands of policymakers and urban planners, etc.? And I guess, again, that it goes back to that point you're making, Mary, about this thing starts a conversation. I think that could be the next, I guess, step for this book itself. So I'll leave it there. But yeah, really, really, really great stuff. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, well, you've got quite a few questions there, and I think, Bob, we're going to hand it over to both of you now, just to respond to some of those, and then there'll be time for other people who haven't spoken so far, but to raise their hands or whatever, indicate they want to ask questions. And I've got a couple of things to throw into the mix as well. So you've got some kind of responses to some of the issues that have been raised by the discussants.
Well, yeah, I guess just first, thank you so much to all of the discussants. I feel, just very honored that you all gave such a close read to the text, and also, the questions are so thoughtful, and I'm excited to engage in all of them. I guess, Mary, should we kind of just go back and forth and answer different ones, or what's the best way to? There's so much to say.
I've binned the questions into two big themes. So
great.
So maybe it makes sense for you to respond to the questions as you heard them, and then I can build off of whatever you throw into the ring.
Sure. Let's see. I don't know if I have two big themes, but I have notes, so I'll try to address some of them. But just first off, thank you again so much. I found it's so fascinating, the differences between housing and public housing in particular in the UK and the US. And I'm familiar with how vastly different the housing landscape is in Romania, where I've done a lot of work, and that's a whole other history and has, a completely different landscape. But I know from going to European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing meetings, just how different housing struggles are in different countries in Europe, never mind in the US. And it is the different histories that have created different relationships to public housing or social housing are really important to think through. So I could go into a whole sort of wormhole with that. But I do think that it says a lot about the US, how little public housing there is. And right now we're in this moment where public housing is, through these RAD programs and other programs, continuing to be lost. And rent controlled and rent stabilized housing is also always under threat, while we're also campaigning to get more rental protections and to expand the scope of what's considered rent controlled housing in California. But it's not, it says so much about the US that this is where we're at. Right now there are, it's the HUD, the Housing and Urban Development department, which has been led by Ben Carson, and we'll see what happens with the Biden administration. But they've basically tried to undo the Fair Housing Act in the US by saying that if a landlord discriminates against a tenant for using a third-party algorithm, that the landlord can't be held responsible. So it's just we're in a very weird moment. And I think that all of the issues we're having around shell companies and speculation that I got into too is also very indicative of a particular kind of capitalism or neoliberalism in the US, in which corporate entities are really running things and are the main landlords at this point, like Blackstone and Invitation Homes being the biggest landlords in the US. But anyway, I also thought it was interesting, the conversation that you brought up, Paul, about YIMBYism. We didn't talk about that in the presentation, but it is in chapter 7, and that's been an interest of mine for some time. But for those who don't know, I guess it sounds like this is the case in the UK, and I don't know how it lives in the UK, but in 2014 in San Francisco, this YIMBY movement began to grow, and we in the mapping project thought it was a joke. The main YIMBY group at the time was called BARF, the Bay Area Renters Federation. So we were just like, who are these people? But basically, they were the ones that spawned this broader YIMBY movement, which is now a movement that, unfortunately, like we have had to take seriously because there's so much capital behind it. But the basic idea is that all housing matters, and that it shouldn't matter whether developers are creating market rate and or luxury housing or public housing. The point is that we need more housing, and that's the only way through development to solve gentrification. And of course, housing organizers have been fighting that narrative, saying, no, what we need is more affordable housing. We need to stop evictions first and foremost. We need to stop speculation. We want more public housing. But anytime that we argue for that, the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement, then says that we're just NIMBYs because we don't want luxury and market rate housing. So it's become this very strange discursive battle that I guess you can see in other political struggles in the US now as well, where different concepts get kind of flipped and used to reproduce contexts of capitalism and racial dispossession. So and I think that's interesting to think about with the comment that that Paul Torle said about nativism too. I think we can look at the YIMBY the NIMBY movement as one in which, often historically you'll see white property owners claiming to be the ones that are from a place and trying to protect that place from newcomers. And then you'll see, like in context of gentrification, folks who are being kicked out lay claim to a certain place as well, but for a very different reason. And then, of course, there are indigenous communities who have been saying, actually, we're still here, and we've been fighting dispossession for centuries. So I think, kind of to Mike's point too, it's like there are so many different narratives we're telling in terms of relationship to place, and I think it's so important to kind of follow the politics behind those claims. And then I guess lastly, to what Glenn said, I was there at 812 Guerrero Street, I think, when you were there, because that was a campaign I was involved with, and it was very, I guess, exemplary of what was going on at the time and still is, where there was a Google lawyer who was evicting 7 units at 812 Guerrero Street, and the tenants did fight back successfully, and they're still there to date. So it really was a victory story, and I'm glad that you were able to be there and to kind of see that solidarity manifest. And that was, I think that was a particularly special campaign because the tenants too were helping other tenants in the city who were facing eviction, and it was this moment of a lot of mutual aid and solidarity, which is manifesting today too in these COVID contexts. But it was really beautiful because just right down the street, another house was being evicted, and the 812 Guerrero tenants were kind of on the front lines, putting their bodies on the front lines and preventing that eviction. So I really am kind of humbled by that solidarity and that it still exists. And then, okay, very last thing, and then I'll send it to Mary. I think to what Mike said about the digital platforms and like how do they could they potentially like alienate tenants from or maybe alienate the work that we're doing from tenants. And I think that's really important to think through. And so for the Evictor book tool that I mentioned, where we have this lookup tool that's trying to automate some of this, we've been building that very intentionally with different member organizations of the San Francisco Anti-Displacement Coalition, which is a coalition that brings together over 20 housing groups in San Francisco. And we've been modeling it with their input and trying to amend it based upon their input. But that's not to say that alone is enough. And I think it is this kind of ongoing challenge that we experience. How do we make sure that we're not just creating some cool tool that looks fancy on the internet but isn't actually doing anything? So I think that's something that we're constantly trying to keep ourselves in check around and think through and get better around. And I guess the Atlas is one of the ways in which we're trying to do this, by creating something that exists offline. And part of the reason we've been doing so much crowdfunding around it for it too is so that we can make sure it's affordable, because we didn't want to create a book about gentrification that costs $100 or something. So it's easier said than done, but I think Mary has a lot more to say about that too, probably. So I'll end it and let Mary speak more.
I can try to address the two big themes that I saw emerging out of all the questions really quickly. So the two themes I saw were one, the kind of neoliberal context, or the intensified neoliberal context of the United States, and kind of the differences between public housing in the US and the UK. And the other big theme that I saw emerging from a lot of the comments was this question of like how, like what kind of violence, like what kind of epistemic violence or justice is done when we are trying to tell the stories of these people who are being displaced. How do we do justice to those stories without kind of reverting to like nativism or kind of like a parochial like interest in like, you know, like not everything staying the same kind of thing. So I think and on the second theme, I see the second theme tied into the first theme through the question of consciousness raising, really. So on the first theme of differences between the UK and the US and public housing, Paul, your comments made me really realize how there's actually, I don't think we really lay out how public housing works in the US and the Atlas. And maybe that's kind of like a weird gap in the Atlas, because yes, so in the United States, there's far, far, far less public housing or social housing, but that wasn't always the case. In the 50s and 60s, there was actually quite a bit of public housing, social housing. And then kind of as part of the neoliberal turn, there was this sense that the market could provide public housing just as well, and it could provide public housing that, or it could be a source of housing for low-income people that wasn't stigmatized in the same way by like having to live in like a big public housing kind of estate. So the United States started tearing down public housing and handing out Section 8 vouchers, which are a way to get subsidized rent. And in the Bay Area, this is, so essentially the market will provide. This is kind of like one of the logics of Section 8. And there's more dignity in renting through the market than, you know, having a handout from the government. In the Bay Area, this is like a really important context, not just because of this broader neoliberal story, but because as prices rise in the Bay Area, there's actually a limit to like, you're not supposed to use your Section 8 voucher for luxury housing, but and HUD determines this by your monthly rent. But in the Bay Area, everything looks like luxury housing because everything is becoming increasingly unaffordable. So so when it comes down to so people know Section 8 is not working in the Bay Area essentially, and right now there are all these requirements for new developers to have a certain percentage of their housing be affordable, but developers constantly petition to get those like requirements waived so that they can have more affordable, they can build more affordably and build more affordable housing for, you know, like build more units at a more affordable price for more people. But of course, like for truly low or even middle income renters, the market is not providing housing. And this is kind of, I would say, you could say a false consciousness that pervades the housing discourse in the Bay Area. It's really, really interesting, this question that Paul Torrell asked about consciousness raising and how the people who are being displaced understand what's happening to them. I would say that the experience of displacement is a politicizing moment, and people start to see that this isn't some anonymous housing market, but there are speculators behind what's going on. There are specific landlords also, and there are other people who have fought their evictions. So one of the early inspirations for the Oral History Project was to just help people visualize their individual experience in kind of a geographical context and create solidarities. And that's been very effective. The mapping project sits between a lot of different tenant and policy groups. So we are also, I think once you get plugged into our work, it's easy to start to see this alternative way of thinking about public space of space in cities as not just like this anonymous market, but rather like a highly structured and highly unequal space. But yeah, that's definitely one of the inspirations for our work, really. And then in terms of like how our work, I really liked Mike Duggan's description of the Atlas not trying to create one story, but rather create a space where different perspectives can respectfully engage each other. I think that's really right. I think it's also really, 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 I think it's also really right, Paul Torrell's observation that some of these narratives can start to feel like nativism or like placemaking towards commodification. That's why in the mapping project, for us, the way that we found our way around that is that it's actually not that complicated to create this space of mutual engagement and really kind of respectful, open, nurturing engagement when you step outside of like neoliberal capitalist ways of thinking about space and ways of thinking about relationships. And for us, the place that we've been most inspired is really by Black and Indigenous organizers and people of color in the Bay Area. So as much as possible as we can, like we try to allow those voices to speak for themselves in the Bay Area, and we try to create a space where we can learn from these like non-capitalist ways, frankly, of thinking about space and organizing. And that's really how we get to step outside of those questions of nativism and placemaking as commodification. Like for people who aren't so embedded in these structures, because they are marginalized, there are still indigenous ways of thinking, of alternative modes of thought that we take real inspiration from. And that's the epilogue of the atlas, really. It's a call to listen to Black, Indigenous, people of color leaders. And that's not like some nod to like, you know, like we respect you. It's like we're really trying to learn, we're trying to think expansively about our cities. And I think that the people that we work with notice that also. And I would like, we do our absolute best. Like I can't speak for them obviously, but you know, we do our absolute best to try to create a platform for people to speak as they want to speak, be represented as they want to be represented. And we're just trying to facilitate that to a certain extent when it comes to telling individual stories. So I would like to hope that people don't feel that too much epistemic violence has been done to their contributions to this broader project. But really, like, thank you for all those comments. They were so insightful, so thoughtful, and really, really generous. We really appreciate it.
And thank you, Mary. Well, I'd just like to follow up on just what you've just been saying, really, about this notion of indigenous cartographies of the city. And I obviously take on board the notion that they can get it kind of anchored to nativist sort of discourses. But I'm just wondering about the role of participatory mapping. I mean, we're rather keen on this in Livingmaps. So that you know, somebody once said, you know, making a map together, sitting around, and we do quite a lot of this work, particularly with young people. You know, sitting around a table with a fairly sparse map and populating the map with stories, with images, with sometimes we use little kind of icons, you know, places that people feel safe or dangerous or whatever. And it provides a kind of conversational frame. The actual collaborative act of making a map together creates a space in which these different narratives can sometimes you know, be teased out and explored, and the tensions between them too. And that's a very different approach to the sort of you know, visualizing, well, which of course you need to do as well, visualizing big data through very sophisticated cartographic techniques and so on. But I just wondered if you used any of those participatory methods. I mean, they don't appear to be there in the atlas, but I mean, I know you've done murals and you've done, you know, other kinds of stuff, but I just wondered about participatory mapping. So that's one question. And the second question is, we're wrestling with in Livingmaps around the Citizens Atlas really, is, you know, why you decided to publish the Atlas as a hard copy book, given that, as you say, I think somewhere in the introduction, that it freezes a particular moment of struggle and of the project, whereas an online thing is, you know, you can add to it, you can revise it, you can have audio visual content, and it seems to be much more kind of maybe even accessible. You know, it doesn't cost bucks to access. So I just wanted to say, the second question then is what you feel is lost and gained by moving from this digital platform onto a kind of hard copy book.
So on the participatory mapping question, that's a really great question. We have done participatory mapping in the past. So the Oakland Community Power Map was a map painted onto a wall in an art gallery that people could put sticky notes onto. And then we've done a fair number of digital, you could say, community power maps where we've used online platforms to allow mostly classrooms like high school and college students to you could say mark up a map with, for example, the history of student protests in Berkeley, or places of community power in the Bay Area more broadly, those types of things. The map that Erin showed at the end of chapter 7 would also be a participatory community power mapping exercise done with elementary school students. But yeah, I don't, in the atlas itself, we don't really take on participatory community power mapping and like what we think it does, although we clearly think it's a really important part of what we do and a really important tool. I think in the mapping project, we think of participatory community power mapping as a way for people to reclaim narrative power over their communities. So instead of seeing their communities only represented as like by real estate speculators, for example, as a place for profit, you can imagine your community as a place of nurturing comfort in the case of these elementary school students, or a place of empowerment, inspiration, rootedness, whatever, right? So it's an example of creating a platform, I would say. And then on the hard copy atlas versus online. So like I said, like one of the inspirations for the atlas was to create something more accessible, especially for folks who didn't have, high-speed internet to play with fancy interactive digital maps. So that was definitely one plus in the column of like, let's do a print atlas. But also like we were at a place where we were starting to see the complexity, the regional, historical, structural complexity of displacement in the Bay Area. And we wanted a format that could allow us to reflect on that in a intentional way and hold all of that together, not homogenize it somehow or like, create a definitive answer, but hold that complexity together and create a format that could hold that together. So yeah, it's definitely a snapshot, but we hope that what you gain from the bounded physical format, both in time and like literal space when it's in front of you, is that it kind of forces whoever's engaging with it to also try to hold the complexity together in a way that a continuously updated online map would just, we didn't feel it could do the same thing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I can also just briefly say that like many of the maps, the ones that we converted to print that existed online, we still update them as best we can. So there are like these sort of updated maps that do take a lot of work to update. And I think the more maps we make, the more work it is to constantly update them, that we try. The other thing is sometimes the digital tools and technologies that we're using expire, or we're trying to move towards completely like open source and free tools. And actually some of the software development we're doing right now is oriented towards building out templates that would be completely independent from even corporate servers, which is really hard. So we're thinking through all of this, but the point being, like, we wanted to also archive a lot of the work that we had in a way that could continue to live offline and independent of some of the digital platforms and tools and the internet even. So I think that because we had been able to like make reports before that did this, but the reports would just be about like a singular place or struggle or moment in time. I think the idea in part was to create something that, like a report, could exist offline. But obviously there's a lot to still think through in terms of making the atlas as accessible as possible to folks who might not be able to afford it or might not know to buy it. And so I think we're at this point trying to figure out how to distribute it to libraries and different community partners, and to make sure that it doesn't exist siloed. So, yeah.
Thanks. Okay, well, we've got about 15 minutes, so now there's people still here, and I know from some of them that they've got a lot of experience, a lot of interest in this area. So, if you would like to ask a question, unmute yourself, make yourself known, and I'm sure Erin and Mary will do their best to respond. So, Debbie, I see you're there. Have you got any thoughts?
Sorry, I'm not in the right place to be visible. But yes, I work with Glyn for homeschool, and I do housing research. I guess just really to reiterate what Glyn's saying, it's such a crucial moment at the moment. It's so scary. Like the fact that there's been eviction moratorium in this country, so people have not been getting evicted through COVID, but what they have been doing is all the debts have been accruing, and when that eviction is lifted, it's not just that people will be able to get evicted, it's the fact that they'll have all these huge amounts of debts that have accrued. So you have people that are going to get evicted and have massive debts. So I just think it is really scary what's coming. And I guess you've got some of, I mean, I just wondered what is going on in that way in the US. I mean, I've heard some of the US activists talking at some of the Homes for All. You know, we've had some presentations with activists from different parts of the world. And so we have heard from some US activists. And so I guess just wondering what's happening now with COVID, how you're responding to that. It just seems such a crisis, and it's kind of like a crisis that's looming. It almost hasn't really happened yet, but we're all about to fall off a cliff. So yeah, that's a bit depressing. But I mean, I loved the book. Obviously, I think the book was just phenomenal. I mean, I know your work, I know the website, and I agree. Actually, I think having a book, because I've got students as well. I think there's something about having the book and the kind of explanation of the top down, and that kind of detailed analysis of the power relations that are going on, as well as the the grassroots narratives, that's really important, and that you can show that to students, and you can, rather than just jumping around a website. So sorry, that's kind of, I wasn't quite expecting to be asked, but so I'm just coming out with like a load of thought. It's just making me think about a lot of different things, and thank you. I just completely knocked out by your work. It's brilliant, and the sort of forensic detail of the analysis is absolutely amazing. So there's a question embedded in there somewhere, and thank you.
All right, thank you, Deb.